Yep.
Yeah, cool. Hi, my name is Paige, and I'm going to be presenting on juror perceptions of child alibi witnesses. A man named Jerry Watkins was arrested in 1987 after being accused of raping and murdering his 11-year-old sister-in-law. He was convicted based on semen found at the scene and a claim made by a jailhouse snitch that he was once housed with. The lab technician testified that the semen was possibly contaminated. He was still convicted despite the fact that Watkins had an alibi supported by friends, family, and coworkers. He passed a polygraph test, and 3 witnesses admitted that the snitch was lying. He was released 13 years later after DNA evidence was more advanced and his semen was found not to be a match. To put this into perspective, 13 years is an entire K-12 academic career. What about Watkins' evidence, in particular his alibi, made it non-believable? An alibi is defined as evidence that the defendant in a criminal act was, at the time of the commission of the alleged offense, at a place other than the place where the offense was committed. Olson and Wells investigated the taxonomy of an alibi, and they concluded that physical evidence always overpowered personal evidence. Physical evidence are receipts, videos, and anything physically found at a crime scene, while personal evidence is an alibi or an eyewitness. Alibis are significant in cases that go to trial. This leaves us wondering how jurors perceive alibis and what constitutes a strong alibi versus a weak alibi, especially when a majority of people are not spending time with people they don't know, but family members, like Jerry Watkins, whose alibi witnesses were family, friends, and coworkers, yet it was still seen as weak. In other words, the last time you went to Target, did you bring company based on how strong of an alibi witness they would be? This idea leads us to question how jurors perceive family members in comparison to strangers, especially since people are not voluntarily spending time with strangers. Dahl and Price further investigated the importance of relationships in a study where participants were asked to be investigators. They were shown a crime video, then asked to pick a suspect. They were then shown an alibi video of a 6 and 25-year-old who identified themselves as a son or a neighbor. The results concluded that individuals who viewed the child alibi witness always saw the suspect as less likely to have committed the crime, regardless of the nature of the relationship of the child to the suspect. Secondly, alibis given by adult children resulted in suspects being seen as more guilty versus adult neighbors. Lastly, children, regardless of relationship, were seen as more credible and believable. This study highlights how adult children were seen to be less trustworthy. This could be because adult children are more likely to lie on behalf of family members. On the contrary, a child family member, or a child in general, was seen to be more believable and credible. Since people are unable to abandon children, especially young children, Dahl and Price further investigated how children are seen as alibi witnesses. In the second study, participants were asked to be investigators in a case where they viewed either 1 or 2 alibi videos. If 2 videos, they were shown a son, either 6 than 11 or 25 than 30, one reported a week after a crime and another 5 years. The manipulated variables were either a major contradiction of a difference in location and activity or a minor contradiction in just activity between the 2 alibis. In the second part of the study, they conducted the same as the first, but they added a third variable of consistency among the alibis. They also changed the age to 6 than 11, 8 than 13, and 11 than 16. They then asked the investigators to rate how probable the suspect was to be guilty. In conclusion, the participants were able to pinpoint a major contradiction, and this was seen as significant, versus a minor contradiction, which was seen as insignificant. Secondly, the jurors expected a second statement to be a restatement, meaning they were not looking for inconsistencies between the 2 statements because they didn't think it would change between time 1 and time 2. Although in past findings, age was seen to be a significant variable, it is speculated that in this study, it was not a significant variable because the mock jurors were more focused on accuracy due to the contradiction variables that were implemented. In a third study conducted by Dahl and Price, they investigated if there was an order effect in the way that personal evidence was presented. In this study, participants were asked to be mock police officers and given a file with an eyewitness description of a culprit. They were then asked to pick a suspect based on the evidence presented. After choosing a suspect, they were shown two videos, an alibi witness and an eyewitness, who either identified the suspect in a lineup or rejected the lineup. The alibi witness was either 6 or 25 and identified himself as the son of the suspect. The findings supported Dull and Price's past findings that when a suspect had a child alibi witness, they were seen as less guilty. There was an order effect that was significant with the child alibi witness. Guilt ratings were seen as lower when the child alibi was seen last compared to when the eyewitness was seen last. On the other hand, when the adult alibi video was presented last, they were seen to be more guilty. These findings lead us to question if children are consistently seen as more believable and credible as child eyewitnesses, will this apply to or as alibi witnesses, will this apply to children as eyewitnesses? Two preschool teachers, Kelly Michaels and Tanya Kraft, had children accuse them of committing sexual acts against them. Kelly Michaels was convicted of over 100 counts of child abuse and sentenced to 47 years. She fulfilled 8 of those 47 years before being acquitted because it came out that the children were not telling the truth. It was suspected that the children were led to fabricate stories through multiple interrogations and being asked leading questions, such as where did Miss Michaels touch you, assuming that Miss Michaels did indeed touch the children. In Tanya Kraft's case, young children accused her of committing sexual acts against them. She was then accused of 22 counts of child abuse. Throughout the trial, the girls gave very vivid and detailed descriptions of what happened to them. As the trial went on, the children's stories were inconsistent and they began to say things as, I just remember this happening, or I don't remember that happening. The case was closed with Tanya being found not guilty of all counts, but at the cost of her time, money, and reputation. High-profile cases such as these lead researchers to investigate child witness credibility. In research, perceived credibility is based on a witness's ability to be competent and trustworthy. If an eyewitness is seen as these things, they are then perceived as credible. Brook and colleagues concluded in a review of child witnesses that credibility is an individual decision, not necessarily based on the reliability and consistency of a child's recall, but on its apparent plausibility. This is seen in the Michael and Kraft's cases. What made the children in Michael's case more believable than in Kraft's case? The literature has been using the two-factor model to see how mock jurors perceive children as witnesses using two factors, honesty and credibility. Credibility is seen as intelligence and memory, while honesty is seen as lying or not having a motive to lie. Younger children have the honesty component, but lack in the cognitive ability component, while older children have the cognitive ability component, but lack in the honesty component. In recent years, Kate and colleagues have implemented the three-factor model with the child credibility assessment scale. They added suggestibility because it is a factor that can stand on its own. Suggestibility is a child's influence, or a child's ability to be influenced by others. It was previously combined with honesty in the two-factor model scale. A majority of child eyewitness research has focused on developmentally normal children, but what about children that have developmental disabilities? Autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by impairments in social communication and interactions, restrictive and repetitive behaviors, and interests. There are many different characteristics and symptoms of ASD. Here are some of the most common social characteristics or social deficits. Failure to maintain back and forth conversation, poor eye contact, and inability to understand others' body language. And some of the restrictive and repetitive behaviors are restrictive body movements and repetitive use of objects and speech. Mars and colleagues conducted one of the first studies of its kind, opening the door to examine what the courtroom looked like for individuals with ASD. In this study, participants read a vignette and were put in one of two conditions, either the label and info group, where they were informed that the defendant had ASD and what its characteristics were, or the no info group, where they were not told that the defendant had ASD. They were then asked to rate the defendants on credibility, looking specifically at likability, cognitive ability, and honesty. The results concluded that the label and info group felt more empathetic towards the defendant and felt as if his ASD is what caused him to commit the crime and act the way he did, whereas the uninformed jurors saw the defendant as an aggressive, dishonest criminal. Many did acknowledge that the defendant's actions were so extreme that he did need professional help, and this leads us to the current study. The current study is aiming to build on Dahl and Price's past findings on child alibi witnesses. In particular, we are most interested in seeing if child alibi witnesses always lead to a more lenient sentence, how jurors will perceive child alibi witnesses based on the three-factor model, and lastly, if being related to the defendant changes how the child is perceived. We plan to add the variable of ASD since knowledge on alibi witnesses with ASD, there is not much knowledge on child witnesses with ASD. Then we hypothesize there will be three main effects based on past findings. First, child alibi witnesses will be seen as more believable. Second, neighbor alibi witnesses will be seen as more believable than adult child alibi witnesses. And lastly, alibi witnesses with the ASD label will be seen as more believable. We will also be exploring perceived suggestibility when assessing child witness credibility. We plan to conduct this study with 250 participants from UND and Mechanical Turks using a 2x2x2 between subjects design with age, relationship status, and ASD label as independent variables. We will be looking at how these variables influence perceptions of honesty, cognitive ability, suggestibility, and guilt. The study will include informed consent, a demographic questionnaire, a criminal vignette manipulation based off Dahl and Price, juror questions, and juror questionnaires asking participants about guilt ratings and their perceptions of the witness, child credibility assessment scale, and a debriefing with payment or credit. We plan to run several analyses of variance to test each of the main effects we expect to find. For each hypothesis, we will use the specific independent variables and the same dependent variables to determine the influence of age, relationship to defendant, and ASD label on the perception of credibility and guilt. If our hypothesis about relationship and age are correct, this is what we expect to see. On the y-axis, we have the guilt rating, and on the x-axis, we have the child age as well as their relationship to the defendant. Recall, we predict a main effect of age regardless of relationship. In other words, we would expect to see much lower guilt ratings in the child condition and in the neighbor condition than in the adult child condition. And then if our hypotheses about ASD is correct, this is what we expect to see. On the y-axis, we have guilt, and on the x-axis, we have age of the witness as well as ASD label. And then we also expect to find lower guilt ratings of defendants with the ASD label than those with the non-ASD label. Then if our hypotheses are proven correct, the implication of our study will be that age is more important than relationship status. Having an ASD status is significant, and the application of the three-factor model to alibi witnesses. Any questions?
So you're going to have like visuals of these people, or is it going to be like?
No, we'll be using a crime vignette, so it's like an ambiguous, like crime situation that's made up.
So it's all written, though we're not going to
Yeah.
see anything.
No, it'll be based off of Dahl and Price's past findings, and we'll probably be using them on one of their vignettes, but it could possibly be changed.
So how descriptive are they? Like if they have people on the spectrum, how descriptive are the behaviors that
Being that this will be the first study of its kind with an alibi witness that has ASD, we're going to have to explore what that vignette looks like, but the main goal is to make an ambiguous vignette, which means that when a pilot study is run, half participants will say guilty and half participants will say non-guilty. And then that way you can actually find results, because not everyone is saying guilty or non-guilty. Any other questions? I'd like to thank the McNear program as well as Dr. Kane, and thank you.